Some games are overrated. That's just the way it is. The blend of hype culture and fandoms result in a world where great games are forgotten and mediocre games get their dicks sucked on an hourly basis. Well, get your dislikes ready, because today I'm going over my picks for the 10 most overrated games of all time. And let me get this out of the way right off the bat. At no point in this video am I saying you can't enjoy these games or that they're bad. You can enjoy whatever you want, and my opinion shouldn't take away from your enjoyment of a game. Most of the games on this list are really well made and high quality games, but they're overrated as shit. But Joe, what is an overrated game? To me, an overrated game is a game that not only gets disproportionate amounts of praise compared to its actual quality, but also has a fan base that attempts to ignore or devalue its flaws. There's various reasons for a game to become overrated, and we'll get into that as we go, but it's time for me to stop stalling. Here come my picks for the top 10 most overrated games of all time. While the original Five Nights game was genuinely really scary and a really unique idea, it got pretty out of control pretty fast. The series quickly blew up with a massive fandom and an extremely complicated lore that I don't even think the series creator fully understands anymore. Five Nights was a really cool idea, but it blew up way too quickly for it to be properly developed, and now it's just another one of those games that's popular for being popular. I mean, if you were following this stuff when it was first coming out, it was some of the weirdest shit ever. People were digging so far into it. And admittedly, some of that did come from the genius attention to detail of Scott Cawthon, but a lot of it also just came from a nonsensical plot that fans had to basically piece together themselves in order to make a narrative. The appeal of Five Nights came largely from what other people did with the material, not the material itself. While the public reputation of Fortnite is quickly declining, it still gets a spot on this list due to the insane amount of people still playing it every single day. With any big game will come a really big fandom, and Fortnite's fandom is fucking massive. And while I do think the game has the potential to be really fun, and I definitely think it made some great pushes for the industry, like with crossplay and a more consumer-friendly business model, the game itself really isn't good. It's full of bugs, there's tons of RNG elements that completely take skill out of the equation. The servers are unreliable, and since the game is constantly changing, the whole experience is just inconsistent. But Fortnite will continue to be a super popular game, and there will be tons of people who think it's the best game ever because, well, just like Five Nights, it's crossed that line into being a game that's just famous for being famous. Also, Fortnite dances. Outlast was one of those games that really pushed the first-person horror genre forward with its lack of combat and creepy atmosphere and weird story, but let's go ahead and compare Outlast to another game of the same genre, Amnesia. Amnesia also features that same style of first-person, no-combat survival horror, but it does pretty much everything better than Outlast does. The story, the atmosphere, the gameplay, the hiding mechanics, the monster AI, the monster design, you name it. Outlast also had a heavy reliance on gross out moments to get easy reactions from the audience, and while there's definitely an art to gross out horror, the Outlast series as a whole kind of has a history of overdoing it.
I do murals with my own feces.
So while Outlast is still a solid horror game, it's definitely not as good as what came before it, and it's certainly not one of the best horror games ever, like I'd see a weirdly large amount of people saying. I really enjoy Modern Warfare 2, and a ton of people are with me in that boat. But despite the game being a huge success critically and financially, when you go back and look at it from an objective standpoint, it's honestly kind of shitty. Granted, that was the whole charm of it, that it was so bad that it was good, but there are a lot of people who think it was a really quality game, and I just don't see that. The multiplayer was extremely poorly designed, to the point that the whole draw of the game became that it was so broken. And the campaign was really just a rehash of all the COD 4 points, but with more explosions and the names twisted around a bit. Just because MW2 was really fun, that doesn't mean it was a well-designed game. I know a lot of people really love Borderlands 2, but I think to say it's a really great game is kind of dishonest. When you take a step back and look at Borderlands 2 compared to Borderlands 1, and also compared to the other games that were out at the time, it really wasn't that impressive. Borderlands 2 is a classic example of a game that came together in a way that was really fun, and that often leads people to saying the game as a whole was amazing and well designed when, just like MW2, there's a huge difference between fun and well designed. Borderlands 2 features extremely repetitive mission and enemy design. The game was definitely more fun with friends, but so is literally every game ever made. While God of War 2018 had some great writing, beautiful visuals, and great presentation, it's hard to ignore that the gameplay was pretty underwhelming if you've played the originals. It's always interesting to me that when you hear people praising the 2018 God of War, you mainly hear about things like the story and the visuals and the writing and the music, but I don't really hear people talking much about the gameplay. Shouldn't that be a sign that a major piece of the puzzle is missing? I'm not saying the combat in God of War 2018 is bad, but I am saying it's nowhere near as good as the original God of War games. Red Dead Redemption 2 was one of the biggest games of the year, and millions of people just adored it. But the reason it gets on this list is something that's a little deeper than just the game itself. Rockstar has been using the exact same structure for their open world games ever since GTA 3. And while they often make up for it with their writing and world building, it's impossible to ignore the fact that their games all feel the same nowadays. And in many ways, they've actually gotten worse because of the removal of player choice. Nakey Jakey did an excellent video on Rockstar's game design a few months ago, and he explained things way better than I ever could, so I'll just link his video down below. But the general gist of it is that Rockstar has been using the exact same gameplay formula since GTA 3, and they've actually been taking away elements of player choice in the process, making all their games feel linear and samey and just giving glimpses of what could have been. I'm not saying that Red Dead 2 and GTA 5 are bad games, but can you imagine just how much better they would be if they weren't constantly holding your hand and putting you in really just narrow, linear storylines and gave you more freedom? Now, let me say this right away, BioShock Infinite has one of the best stories in video game history, hands down. But where it falls apart is the gameplay, which you mathematicians out there might know is kind of a central part of a video game. The gameplay of BioShock Infinite is repetitive, generic, and in some cases just flat out bad. Whereas BioShock 1 and 2 had really interesting gameplay that mixed survival and horror along with some good tough combat sections and action set pieces. BioShock Infinite threw all that out the window and just turned it into a generic, straightforward FPS that we've all played a million times. To say the overall game is excellent because the story is good is just being dishonest, because the gameplay is extremely underwhelming. While I do think Skyrim is a pretty excellent game and deserving of all the sales and hype surrounding it, the main reason it gets a spot on this list is the fact that it really isn't better than the two Elder Scrolls games that came before it. Morrowind was released in 2002, and Oblivion was released in 2006. Both were excellent fantasy RPGs with massive worlds and tons of side quests, great stories and music, and pretty much endless things to do. Then, when Skyrim came along in 2011, the hype train really got chugging, and it quickly became one of the biggest games of all time. But really, what did Skyrim do that Oblivion and Morrowind didn't do first? In fact, you could argue that there's things like quest design and world building that were actually worse in Skyrim. Skyrim was kind of just in the right place at the right time, whereas Morrowind and Oblivion were ahead of their time. I'm actually really interested to hear an opinion of someone who started their Elder Scrolls experience with Skyrim and they never played Morrowind or Oblivion, but then going back and playing them now. You know, I think Yahtzee said it best in his review back in 2013.
Astonishingly, Naughty Dog have actually started a new IP without waiting for a new console for once, and perhaps the high profile achieved by the Uncharted games has led them to feel they have to make whatever the video game equivalent of Oscar bait is. So it wants to be this big serious exercise in character development, but it's also very, very safe. For a start, it's zombie apocalypse, which as I said is to most people already a more familiar setting than the 1980s, and in gameplay terms it's mostly that basically functional hodgepodge of stealth, cover shooting and scripted set pieces that a lot of big AAA releases have gone for lately, while wearing the ever-vague action-adventure t-shirt.
Is The Last of Us good? Yes, absolutely it's good. But is it the best game ever like a lot of people say? I really don't think so. When you look at the game piece by piece, it's really kind of formulaic. In terms of gameplay, what did The Last of Us do that Uncharted hadn't already done aside from the stealth mechanics? And while the story was well presented, it was very predictable, and there were many characters that were poorly explained and really only served to push Joel and Ellie's characters forward in some way. Which is fine, but it definitely makes the world feel a lot more shallow. And then, depending on who you were, you either loved or hated the ending, because the impact the ending had pretty much relied on how you felt about the characters, and like I said, the characters were kind of a mixed bag. I know I didn't really care for the ending. The Last of Us is absolutely not a perfect game. There's a lot of really big flaws with it that people love to just ignore. So those are my picks for the most overrated games of all time. Be sure to leave your opinions in the comments, as well as what instrument you think I should use to kill myself because I hurt your feelings. And also, while you're at it, consider following me on Twitch and Twitter, and maybe supporting me on Patreon. Links to all three of those wonderful places down below. I have a couple of videos in the works right now, but they may be a couple days away because they're kind of big and long and thick.